So your book really, as I understand it, has two parts. The first part is about the way in which Christianity is an integral part of American polity. And you talk about civic, the civic polity and the religious institutions complementing each other. And in the second part, you talk about how those religious institutions, in particular evangelical Christianity, could be reformed or returned to a reading of Christianity that is more compatible with US civic virtues rather than being merely a political partisan affiliation. And I'd like to start by talking about that first thing because I was wondering whether there's a connection here between your earlier book on the Constitution of Knowledge and this book. One connection that I see is that you have a lot of faith in the power and importance of institutions. Was that a conscious connection as you were writing this book, that you were thinking about the importance, the centrality of institutions in a very similar way to the way you do with institutions that promote knowledge in the Constitution of Knowledge?
Yes, thank you. I suppose it was conscious in the sense that I see liberalism, what I think Australians understand as liberalism, which is what we sometimes call classical liberalism, not the US style, post-war left-wing progressive type of thing. I understand liberalism and the institutions and rules and philosophies of liberalism to be the basis of modern civilization and most of the good things that have come into the world over the past 350 years, like the knowledge we have of the universe, the ending of most wars between the liberal countries, remarkable amount of freedom, the ability for me as a gay man to be open, to be married, women's rights, all those other forms of of progress. And my charter has been trying to figure out why people in so many places are becoming so sour on these institutions and endangering them to the point in the United States right now of a real crisis. And so both of these books are efforts to understand what's gone wrong, one with our epistemic order and the other with the Christian underpinnings that we had relied on for so long to help hold the country together.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in the fact that the US is such an outlier among developed Western nations in the number of people who are churchgoers and believers. So I live here in Australia, which is probably I've lived in 7 different countries, and this is probably the best governed, most harmonious country I've lived in. You wouldn't think that from Twitter. If you just went by Twitter, you'd think this was a dystopian hellhole where we're all at each other's throats. And I think living here has really brought home to me what a gap there is between the fights on Twitter and how real life feels on a general daily basis. This is like most developed countries, this is an extremely secular country. Most Australians they're not religious. They don't believe in God. They don't go to church, possibly some at Christmas or to get married or baptized or buried. But it's not a major part of people's lives. And the US is a strong outlier in that most other countries that are strongly religious are underdeveloped countries, theocracies, illiberal or totalitarian countries like Pakistan, where I grew up. Why do you think that the US is such an outlier in that regard?
Well, I should say it's significantly less of an outlier in 2025 than it was in 2020. Back then, the conventional wisdom was that America really stood apart from the rest of the developed world in its religiosity. That's not so true anymore. It's still true to an extent, but we have seen in the United States, just in this century, really in the past 20 years, a collapse of faith, especially Christianity. And that's brought with it in its train, a whole series of social difficulties, which are attributable, of course, to more than one thing. I don't believe in monocausality. And, you've had cell phones and fragmented media and failed institutions, and all of that sort of thing. But a big chunk of the increase in, for example, depression, anxiety, loneliness, social isolation, and I think especially intense partisan polarization, the substitution of partisan identity for what used to be more of a religious identity, all of those things have caused a bunch of social pathologies. So it turns out that the United States is becoming more like other developed countries in terms of being secular, but we relied more than they did on religion, specifically on Christianity, which is the country's by far majority faith. We relied on Christianity. It was a load-bearing wall here in a way that it did not have to be in many other countries for various reasons. So I think that means we're suffering more for the collapse of that wall.
Why do you think it was so much more of a load-bearing wall in America than elsewhere?
Well, of course, sociologists will argue about that until the cows come home. But the standard story is that we are an immigrant society and a very diverse society, and thus relied on creed. That included, of course, the constitutional creed, the creed of the founders, but it also included Christian creed to kind of knit us together. Iona, when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, often the first thing someone asked when they met somebody was not, what do you do for a living, or where did you go to college? It was, what church do you go to? 70% of Americans were churchgoers right through the last century. Today, it's under half. That's a change of a magnitude we haven't seen before. And when a country goes through a change that wrenching, it's not as if a substitute can spring up overnight for all of what Christianity has been doing. And that includes providing a transcendental account of life's meaning, something higher than ourselves that we live for, providing collective worship, connections to other people, a way to socialize and educate children into a person's values. It turns out you just don't get those things from Soul Cycle, which is a United States, a cult-like exercise organization. And even less do you get it from, MAGA and QAnon and these other radical political movements, which people are looking to for a source of identity. And that means we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, I was quite interested in this idea that religious people get their meaning from a belief in God. I've recently been listening to the statements that the freed hostages have made who've come back from Gaza. And although Israel is also an outlier country in terms of religiosity, although I think many of the most religious people are not in the IDF and would also not have been living in the border kibbutzim. So this may be a slightly different group that we're talking about, a more secular group. But I'm quite struck by the fact that none of the hostages, at least as far as I know, mentioned God as part of what was sustaining them, or a belief in God. And what they mentioned, of course, was not Soul Cycle, but it was they were sustained by each other, by the presence of other hostages, those who were kept with other hostages, and also by a hope for reunion with those outside, those back in Israel. So I think that it's maybe you overstate the case a little bit about the necessity for religion as a source of more transcendental meaning, because I think a lot of people take that meaning from each other primarily, from
I
relationships with
agree.
other people.
It's easy to come off with a stronger statement than I intend. So I should clarify, I am not a believer. I'm Jewish, but I don't believe in God. I tried at one point. I just couldn't. And I'm gay, so I am well acquainted, as all gay Americans of my generation are, with the cruelty and bigotry and hypocrisy of Christians in this country. I have never held and do not hold that America is a Christian nation, and that if you're not a believer, you can't be just as good a citizen and just as moral a person. I mean, I think I'm a very reasonably moral person, and I don't go around in a state of existential dismay because I don't believe in God. So, But a lot of what I'm saying is that the substitutes that people have looked for, many people do look for transcendent meaning. They do look for a relationship with something higher than themselves. And they do look for sources of social connection that are consistent, and they do look for a foundation for values, for right and wrong. And it turns out that when Christianity fades, a lot of those people go other places in order to get those goods. And those other places range from strange and ineffective, like, witchcraft, Wicca, personal fitness movement, radical environmentalism, to downright poisonous and toxic. And toxic polarization, extreme polarization, has become of such a scale, I would argue, that it's effectively making America ungovernable. So it's not that everyone has to be religious, but it is that Christianity was doing a lot of social jobs in the United States. And its weakening has at least not so far given rise to adequate substitutes.
How much do you think that it is Christianity specifically that's important here? So one thing, of course, that has just happened yesterday, which has absolutely shocked us here in Sydney, is two nurses who have declared on video that they wanted to kill Jewish patients and have already killed Jewish patients because of their Muslim beliefs.
My God.
And yeah, I don't know that this will be an international scandal, but perhaps it hasn't quite diffused very widely yet. I'm sure it will. This is a nuclear level scandal. And I think that I wonder how much work Christianity is doing also to create a strong sense of national identity and values that allows you to push back against those kinds of more toxic ideologies, such as, I would argue, most mainstream Islam.
Well, it's clearly not doing a very good job of that right now. The first chapter of my book is about what I call thin Christianity, which is what happened to the ecumenical churches in the last century. They became so watered down, unanchored from scripture and culturally very much like the surrounding culture, that people just drifted away and they stopped being relevant. And the second chapter is called Sharp Christianity, and that's about what happened to white evangelicals. And that's a very big designation, but it includes most white Protestants these days, including some charismatics and non-denominationals and people like that. And their version of secularization wasn't blending into the culture. It was essentially merging with the Republican Party and bringing politics to the church and the church to politics, and giving politics an apocalyptic sense of every election is a conflict between good and evil. And if we lose this election, we lose our country and we lose our religion. And it brings politics to church, and it says the church needs to fight, fight, fight. One pastor I know called it a battlefield mindset. And so my contention is, first of all, that's not very Christian. Now, I'm not a Christian, so who am I to say? But I draw on a lot of people who are. And that real Christianity, the actual thing, is closely aligned with the values that actually make our country run, the fundamental liberal values enshrined by James Madison. But what's replaced it and calls itself Christianity is very different. And this book is a cri de coeur, saying our country would be doing a lot better, and probably the witness of the church would be doing better, if they returned to the message of Jesus Christ and got away from the message of MAGA.
Yeah, you talk about a load-bearing wall, and also I think at some point about a kind of a division of labor. This is not the phrase you use, actually. You talk about a cultural import, an import deficit, a trade deficit. And what you seem to be talking about is a kind of division of labor, that people should keep their partisan politics separate from their religious convictions, so that it shouldn't become merged into one, which seems to me like what's happening with the evangelical Christians is a mirror image of what has been happening on the woke left, which is this kind of evangelical style of politics in which you really believe that politics, rather than being about compromise and trying to find the truth by arguing with people, by debating and discussing and having different points of view. You have basically, when you go to the polling booth, there's a cross for the good and there's a cross for the evil. And both sides seem to be taking that kind of view, both though they just think that the side that is good and the side that is evil are just reversed for them. And that seems to a very naive way of looking at political disagreements, and also very extremely destructive to social harmony. So do you think this is connected to the politicization of everything, or do you think it is a more specific problem within the church?
Sure. We're seeing, so this is a bigger problem than just the problem I'm writing about in this one short book. My book is about Christianity per se, and it's addressed to Christians because I think that secular liberals like me have neglected the importance and centrality of Christianity for far too long, and that we are part of what has led to the collapse of this load-bearing wall, and it's hurting us as well. But yeah, unquestionably, there's a resemblance between woke ideology structure, not its tenets, but its structure, and a kind of religious faith. I mean, we all remember during the George Floyd riots, maybe this made its way to Australian media, I don't know, but there was footage of someone actually washing the feet of an African American.
Yes,
in a symbolic gesture. And many of the other ideas, original sin, we're all racist, and repentance, these struggle sessions they have, but where people are called up to the altar to express their guilt and repent. And all of that stuff looks a lot like displaced energy from the collapse of what was Christian faith and bringing that over into the left wing. So yes, all of that is a problem. I would, though, say that there's one important asymmetry between the left and the right on this score. I don't think that woke ideology, however defined, has within it major essential truths which, if we lived by, would make us better off. I mean, there's a few things in there that are useful. I think the idea of structural racism has merit, and we can learn from that. But for the most part, it's a kind of postmodernism, post-Marxist grab bag of illiberal bad ideas. I think, on the other hand, that the three core teachings of Jesus Christ, as I understand them and as explained to me by theologians, are very, very good ideas, and that they are closely mirrored in the ideas of James Madison and the founders. There's a natural alignment there. You don't have to stretch to get it. It's right there in the gospel. And that means that Christianity per se, not just religion generically or faith generically, but Christianity per se, should it choose to go back to its own core principles, has a role to play in healing our society because they're good principles. We can talk about what they are. But that's a fundamental difference between Christianity and many of these other faiths or neo-faiths or pseudo-faiths.
Can you just outline for us those three principles that you talk about in the book?
I'd love to. It takes about a minute and a half, so I may filibuster for just a moment.
Sure,
but
go ahead.
It's really the core of the argument of the book. If there's a contribution in the book, this is probably it. Theologians say that three core ideas distinguish Christianity from everything else. And they are, number one, don't be afraid, the most frequent injunction in the Christian Bible. Don't be running around with your hair on fire. Exhibit a calm sense of confidence. Second, be like Jesus, imitate him. And third, forgive each other. Retribution is God's job, not ours. Those map very well onto the core assumptions of liberalism, or what the founders of the United States called Republican virtues. The first, don't be afraid, maps onto sometimes you lose an election. It's not the end of the world. You're going to have to share power, and we'll all benefit from that. And actually, so will you. You'll learn something from being out of power. Thus, in other words, don't claim you won the election when you lost. Second, imitate Jesus. So Jesus ministers to the poorest and weakest and most marginalized. He makes that a point of Christianity. That's new in religion, by the way, and that comes over into liberalism in the core protections in our Constitution and in all the liberal regimes of minorities and minority rights. There's some things majorities just cannot do. Jesus also preaches the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. He's a radical egalitarian in that way, and that also was a new idea in his day. That comes over in the liberal concept that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. In liberalism, as in Christianity, you're not allowed to use people as means to an end. People always have to be an end unto themselves. This is something that wokeness and those other illiberal doctrines all wave aside. But those essential tenets are common to both. And the third, of course, is forgive each other. That maps onto sometimes you're going to win an election. And when you win an election, your goal is not to crush the other side and make sure that they never come back into power. It is not to salt the soil with the tears of the women and children who you will drive willy-nilly over the landscape. You're going to share the country. You're going to treat the other party, the party that lost, with the kind of grace and magnanimity that you will want to be treated by when the tables turn. And not just for that conditional reason, but because that's a Republican virtue. Our founders told us, in as many words, Madison, Washington, Adams, Franklin, they all said that the liberal constitutional order they gave us was a process, but it rested on values external to the Constitution, what they called Republican virtues. And they said we as citizens would have to go and get those values and inculcate them in our schools and our civil societies and in our families and our communities and in Christianity and our faith. They counted on our faith traditions to be aligned with democracy, and Christianity at its core is. The problem is so much of it isn't acting that way. Thanks for letting me ramble.
No, you're welcome. Please take as much time as you need. I really like your vision of Christianity, and I'll just preface this with a disclaimer that I'm also an atheist, plus I'm not culturally Christian either. I grew up as a Zoroastrian, I'm a Parsi, and so I'm not exactly an expert on Christianity, but however, this is one issue, I think, is that there have always been competing visions of Christianity and competing interpretations of what the Bible means. And there certainly is a more militant interpretation that's possible. One of the things that other people have quoted to me is that Jesus also says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And there definitely could be an interpretation, which is we need to fight for our values to be upheld, and those values will also be expressed in political policy. In politics, a large part of politics is about fighting over priorities and values. It's not all about it's not all purely procedural, and you have issues that have intrinsic ethical questions built into them, such as assisted dying or abortion. So I can see how some people might feel there is actually there's a religious mandate or even requirement to be active within politics on the side that you feel is upholding the values that are most important to you and that you think are central to your religion.
Of course, one's faith, for those who have faith, is something that shapes and conditions their entire being, including their values and their politics, and everything else. And America is much the richer for the faith traditions that have informed its politics. So it's not about whether people should bring their religious convictions into their civic and political lives. And it's also not about what particular positions they wind up with, even on difficult issues like abortion or homosexuality, where churches are, well, not so much on abortion, on the right, but certainly homosexuality. We've seen deep divisions and we've seen schisms. And of course, all of that is taken for granted. The question here isn't the what, it's the how. It's how do you engage with your fellow citizens in the realm of politics? Do you do it in a way that attempts to look for paths toward at least compromise, if not conciliation? The U.S. Constitution at its core is a compromise-forcing document. So do you look for ways to enlarge the space so that people can live together with their disagreements when we can't work them out? Do you look for creative solutions when people can work them out? There are lots of examples of this. This is what Madison set up our system to do. And how do you talk to people? Do you treat them as vile scum that need to be wiped off the face of the planet? Do you encourage a vocabulary of fear? This is the last election if our side doesn't win. It's the end of everything. Do you encourage a battlefield mindset, which is, this is a war which we've got to win? Do you say things like, I am your retribution? There's nothing very Christian about that. Do you say things like characterizing an entire population of humans as, and I quote, vermin? So this is about how you approach the civic space. Evangelicals have this notion, which I was unaware of until I wrote this book. It's called disciplement or discipleship or spiritual formation. And it's the idea of making oneself and one's life in the image of Jesus, being like him. You disciple yourself toward Jesus. And American Christians, we're talking now about white Protestants now. American white Protestants still do a pretty decent job of discipling people in their personal lives. You know, that's at the soup kitchen, for example, or when the hurricane strikes, they're there in the community. But it really has essentially nothing to say about what it means to behave like Jesus in our civic lives. How would Jesus want to address each other in our civic life, on social media, for example, and in the context of politics? Into that void, that lack of theology around civic theology has rushed in these very toxic, angry, no-holds-barred secular alternatives, and they have infected the religious space. So that, I think, does that go to the point that you're raising about politics?
Yeah, partly. I just want to, as an aside here, why is it specifically white Protestants? So why do you think Black congregations don't play a role in this? Do you see that
They certainly
as
do play a
culturally
role.
different?
And if I'd had more space and more time to write a longer book, it's a short book by design. The Black church has a lot to teach us. Martin Luther King was the greatest, I think, the greatest civic theologian of the last century, and a just remarkable figure in what he taught about how to engage the civic environment as a Christian. But the reason I focus on white evangelicals is that they are where the crisis is. They are the nub of what's called Christian nationalism, which takes many forms, and dominionism, and what's called the Seven Hills philosophy. They are the rank and file of the MAGA movement. Without white evangelical voters, Harris would have won in a landslide. They are the group that is not only supporting the MAGA movement, but wildly enthusiastic about it, and are branding those values as Christian when in fact they are not. So that's where the crisis is. Jews, we have our problems, but we're not enough to drive the country into the ditch. Same is true of Muslims and Buddhists and everyone else. But white evangelicals are the founding faith in America and still immense in their numbers and influence. And if you want to understand what's toxifying our political environment, why we're becoming ungovernable, you have to hunt where the ducks are, and that's where they are.
It's you talk a lot about the hypocrisy of the evangelical support for the MAGA movement, given Trump's own personal character and clear irreligiosity, amorality, etc. And I do want to come back to a model that you found, which of a religion that is taking more civic duties more seriously, and that's the Mormons. I want to come back to that in a second, but I do think that there is a more fundamental issue, which is that one of the things that prevents violent partisanship is the knowledge that your political affiliation or is only one part of what's important in life, is only one part of your personality, your goals, your aims, your commitments, etc. Or that rather, I think, is the healthier stance to take. And also a fundamental commitment to democracy, which has got to go along with a feeling that you wouldn't want your own side to win and be in power forever, because then you would have totalitarianism. In order to not have totalitarianism, you need opposition, and it's your opponents who keep you honest, because they have a vested interest in pointing out where you're wrong, and they have a vested interest in pushing back against your side's excesses. But religion is tends to be more ambitious than that, in that in most religious countries, setting aside the United States for a moment, the idea is that your religion should be the central core of your being, and therefore it should inform everything you're doing. It's not just one part of your commitment. It's a full commitment pervading everything. And that is the situation in Pakistan. And that's kind of how you get countries like Pakistan. So I think that there is a fundamental tendency for Christianity to go in this direction. So I think I disagree with your central optimism about Christianity's compatibility with a liberal society, or religion's compatibility.
You think Christianity inherently tends toward illiberalism? Is that it?
I think it's always got that potential. That's always a possible and valid reading. I'd like you to talk a bit about the Mormon vision of civic life, because I think that was very surprising to me and inspiring. And you use it as a kind of model for other Christian sects to imitate in some ways. Can you talk a bit about what you discovered about the Mormon attitude towards these things?
Yeah, this was actually a big surprise to me also, and one of the inspirations for writing this book. So just on your last point, before we go there, I just say, at least by way of an asterisk, that of course, I'm a gay American, homosexual, born in 1960, and no one needs to lecture me on the dark side of Christianity. It persecuted me. It supported 60 years of an all-out assault on gay people, called us every name in the book. You literally, when I was growing up, you couldn't turn on the car radio on a Sunday and not hear a preacher going on about how homosexuals were seducing children and bringing God's wrath down upon the country and were a stench in God's nostrils. So believe me, I get it. But what I want to say,
I didn't mean to lecture you in any way.
No, I didn't feel lectured. Oh, I may have misspoken there. But the point is, I'm agreeing with you. But I think people make religion stupid rather than the other way around. All those natural tendencies to be dominating and dark and sinister are there in us, and they infect every religion. What I want to say in this book, I could just be wrong about this, but I want to say that you can't just look at religion sort of, or any particular faith, just generically as an empty box into which people pour their sociology or their demographics or their income and education or their politics. You have to look at the theology. What does the scripture actually say? And yes, accepting that you can proof text, different verses of the Bible and use them in all kinds of ways. I have yet to meet a Christian, a theologian, who disputes that the three things we discussed about earlier are central pillars of Christianity. Some of them add repentance as a fourth. And so what I'm insisting on is that it's the actual doctrines of Christianity that have this healing potential for the country. And that's a more specific claim than just saying religion is good, we should have more of it. It's about the message of Jesus Christ right now as it relates to a liberal republic. That's a controversial claim in its own way, but it's a different way. So I was gobsmacked in 2015. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they now like to be called, struck what was called the Utah Compromise. And of course, Utah is, as your listeners will know, is the state where the church headquarters are and where it's a very, very big influence. And they supported a civil rights bill that extended anti-discrimination protections for LGBT people and included in that specific exemptions for churches and faith-based organizations like, Brigham Young University would not have to put same-sex married couples in married student housing. And this was a cultural breakthrough in the state that lasts to this day. You can go ask the LGBT group that was also part of that. It was transformative in how positive the state is as an environment for gay people. Then in 2021, the second in command in the church gave a remarkable speech at University of Virginia, one of a series of speeches he did, saying that he comes as an apostle of Jesus Christ to say that what Jesus wants us to exhibit in civic life is patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And my jaw flew open because that is not the way the U.S. Conference of Bishops or most white evangelicals talk. They talk in a very different way. In 2022, the church went a step further. In that church, it's very conservative. Homosexuality is a sin, no ifs, ands, or buts. And same-sex marriage can get you excommunicated if you do it. Nonetheless, they were part of a coalition that put together a compromise package in the Congress that wrote my same-sex marriage into federal law. That had not been done before. It was mandated by the Supreme Court, but people were thinking, oh my God, this new Supreme Court could take it back. They gave it, they could take it away. Well, not anymore. And as part of that package, once again, there were important new protections for religious liberty. So what they're doing is making a deal which says, okay, if we can be assured of the space within our community to pursue our moral vision, we want to expand the space for people in other communities to have their moral vision. And if that includes same-sex marriage for them, no skin off our nose, as long as we're protected in our beliefs. That's pure Madisonian pluralism. So I start looking into that and asking questions, and it turns out there's a whole theology. It goes back to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden about why this is what Jesus wants Christians to do in the public realm. Now, some people said, don't put them in the book because most evangelicals don't think Mormons are Christians. But I looked at this and said, no, I'm not saying that anyone needs to be a Latter-day Saint in order to do this. I'm saying this is an example of how a church can look at the doctrines of its faith and look at a modern, pluralistic, liberal society and show that they are in alignment, elevate the aspects of its own faith, which help it to be a force for what they call peacemaking in society. And I look at that and I say to Christians, okay, all the elements are there in your teachings for being peacemakers in our society. And if Latter-day Saints can do this, so can you. Why not give Jesus a try?
I thought there were some important lessons there for secular liberals as well, in that what I saw in you outlining in the book on a number of occasions is that if you are willing to carve out religious compromises, i.e. to allow religious organizations to be exempted from certain laws, then you're much more likely to be able to pass those laws. So you can gain greater freedom by allowing people who don't agree to opt out. I thought that was,
I'm nodding my head. Yes.
Was an important thing.
That's exactly right. This is not about giving up on your core values and compromising those away. This is about looking for ways to deconflict the situation where we disagree and expand the space so that we can go about our lives without coming into conflict so much.
Yeah, I find the Latter-day Saints theology fascinating. Their reading in particular of the Adam and Eve and the eating of the apple.
Yeah, what did you think of
Could you
that?
talk? Yeah, I thought that was great.
Did you? I did too.
Yeah.
I read that and a light bulb went on. I said, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah, do you want to explain that for our listeners?
I will do my best. I should say I am not a Christian and I'm also definitely not a Latter-day Saint. But the church leaders have told me that this account I'm about to give is in the right ballpark. So the post-Augustinian Christian consensus is that because Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, that was the original sin that brought suffering into the world and was a very bad thing. Latter-day Saints reject that reading. They're pre-Augustinian, and they say, no, God gave Eve that choice, put that tree there for a reason. And that was to give humans the choice of whether they wanted to be like cattle, which is to say they wouldn't have a sense of good and evil and they'd walk around naked, not knowing it, and they'd never have a difficult decision to make, or whether they wanted to actually make moral choices. And so Latter-day Saints believe that Eve did the right thing. She didn't commit an original sin. There was no original sin. We're all born free of original sin. And we dedicate our lives not to repenting for the sins of Eve a zillion years ago, but bringing ourselves closer to God by making good moral choices. That's what Eve gave us the power to do. They call this their doctrine of agency, which is a little like free will. But free will says every one of us has the capacity to make moral choices. Agency goes a step further, and it says every one of us should have the opportunity to make moral choices. We have to have actual choices to make, or else we can't learn and grow by making those choices, and so we won't become more godlike. That means it is a sin in that church to go around the country with thou shalt written into law, telling everyone what moral choices they need to make, because that deprives those people of the ability to choose and grow. Well, as you can see here from the point that we've now reached to classic Madisonian pluralism, which is we live with each other by not trying to dominate each other and impose morality on each other, it's like a 1-inch hop, right? It's more or less the same thing. But what this does is this is a true civic theology. This is not just a strategy about, how you get what you want from the Congress or the culture. This is a fully articulated civic theology of how God wants us to make moral choices and engage in the civic sphere. And I find that inspiring.
Yeah, me too.
You were surprised, huh?
Yeah, I was surprised. I really liked that reading. I've always thought that was a kind of a very self-contradictory, which I would expect from religion, but also just
The Augustinian account, you mean, the
a
fall and all
wrong.
that.
Yeah, it seems very wrong. Why wouldn't you take knowledge if you could have it? Why wouldn't it be better to know things than to remain in ignorance? Yeah. Although I think they should have chilled out a bit when they realized they were naked. They should have just become nudists rather than immediately popping on a fig leaf. So the first thing that happened with their knowledge is that they were unwise and mistaken in their interpretations of things. Yeah. So yeah, that was a great interpretation. So I do feel there's an overarching theme here, which is that liberalism is very much concerned with individual rights and with the freedoms and values of individuals, and not in, of course, not in the kind of, it's not all about, when I talk about individuals, it's not all about selfishness or hedonism, etc. That's a misinterpretation that the post-liberals, like people like Sohrab Ahmari and Patrick Deneen have. But it is fundamentally about individuals. And I feel that in your work, you are very much concerned with the value and importance of overarching structures of being, of having the right institutions and structures in society that will facilitate working together. Would you say that that's correct? And Christianity is just a good structure to have.
that Christianity is just a good structure, or liberalism is a good structure?
Well, liberalism is kind of not a structure in a sense. It's a set of beliefs, but it needs to be. It's kind of it's the software, but it needs like a boot code, and it needs to be embedded in it needs to be embedded in and defended by institutions. And I have to say that um, I've lost faith in a lot of institutions recently. I think I've become much more skeptical of individual universities as institutions, even though I think the university is an extremely important thing for all of the reasons that you outline in the Constitution of Knowledge. I've also been extremely disheartened by the actions of the United Nations, the Red Cross, organizations like Amnesty International. And I I think that one thing that you have is a strong belief in the ability of institutions to reform, and also a strong belief in the kind of worth of institutions for their own sake. Can you talk about a Mormon idea that relates to this, which is that just as we should have forgiveness for flawed human beings, institutions are just collections of individuals, and we should also have forgiveness for flawed institutions and believe in their redeemability. Is that an accurate, fair summary?
Well, that's partly accurate. What's inaccurate about it is that's not a Mormon belief. That's separate. After looking
Sorry.
at the Latter-day Saints, I started poking around and looking at Christians who are doing creative thinking about civic theology. And one of them is a former pastor named Curtis Chang, who's also a writer and a reformer. And yes, he talks about grace toward institutions. Christians are supposed to give individuals the benefit of the doubt and not judge them too harshly and show them grace. Yet every time some institution makes even one small mistake, we judge it to be worthless, or when it doesn't serve our needs at the moment, because it doesn't make the decision that we wanted to make. We want to throw it out, burn it down, and start over. And he says, no, we need to show grace to institutions. And there are other people in this space. The author and activist Michael Ware of the Center for Christian Civic, something, I don't remember. But there are people starting to do this work of thinking, okay, so what would be when you take Christian principles and you start extending them to the public sphere and you start talking about institutions, how does that ramify? And that's brand new, and I don't know if it'll become major. Right now, it's very embryonic. But I look for hope where I can find it. These are dark times in America right now. I don't have to tell you that as we speak. We're in the midst of what I think is a constitutional crisis. The president is destroying institutions and institutional norms right and left. He is blatantly defying laws. He is withholding funds from agencies that Congress chartered and funded. He is allowing people who have no real government office to simply walk in the door of agencies, rewire them, take their data, shut them down. These things are without precedent in America. So you're right. I do look for, wherever I can find them, and this has been a theme for my whole career, I look for ways to shore up the values and institutions that keep liberalism alive. I do think you said something before which I would take exception to, at least if only in emphasis, which is the idea that this isn't what you said, but I'll make the Deneen style version. This is Patrick
Sure.
Deneen, who's a anti-liberal, which is that liberalism is just all about individuals and selfishness, and really
Not
doesn't.
selfishness, no, but it is
But
about individuals, I would say.
well, okay, let's take away selfishness, but let's say all about individuals and individualism, and I think that's a bit of a caricature. Actually, it is true that the locus of fundamental rights is the individual, which means there are some things that you just can't do to individuals, period, under liberalism. That is a core idea and a revolutionary idea. But the original classical liberals were not libertarians. They had a sophisticated sense of the kind of architectures you need that are collective and institutional to run the country, that's Madison, of the ways in which collective action coming out of individualism, but having emergent properties of entirely of their own can make us knowledgeable and rich. That's Adam Smith and the scientific revolution. So they were far more sophisticated than today's, purely individualistic caricature of liberalism, which is what we see from its critics and also from some libertarian types. Sorry, maybe that was a digression, but it's a point on which I guess I feel a little bit defensive.
I wanted to ask you about that just briefly, if you would, your critiques of the post-liberal types like Deneen and Amari, on whom I think we're very much in agreement. And one of the things that you say in the book, if I'm remembering this accurately, when they say that the liberal democracy isn't working, what is their alternative? Where is the example of an undemocratic country? Where's the example of a theocracy in which people are flourishing and doing well?
Well, this is a setup question, because we both know the answer is we don't know where this example is because they won't tell us. There is no specific regime that they will point to. The changes, the reforms that they do point to are mostly things that we could perfectly easily embody and institute within liberal democracy right now. There's no reason not to do them. They're just policy changes, and there's very little coherence to their views. So I give them some ink in my book, not very much because I don't want to write about them. But I am willing to concede that there is a kernel of truth, an important kernel of truth in their critique of liberalism, which is, no, unlike, they are not correct that basically liberalism is like a lawnmower that dissolves all norms and values and destroys faith, family, tradition, and community wherever it finds them. That is false. If you want to look at the destroyer of faith, family, tradition, and community, you can look at a totalitarian, autocratic, or theocratic state. But they are correct that it is hard to be a person of faith in an individualistic and consumeristic liberal society like the one we have right now, where you've got competition from cell phones and Amazon.com, and people can lead pretty hedonistic lifestyles if they want to. So they're right about that. But never has America, or I would argue any country in history, been as protective of religious rights and liberties as the United States is right now. And this is a book about Christianity, and the critics are Christians. Christianity is not supposed to be easy. And it never was easy. It's supposed to be countercultural or exilic, as it's sometimes called. It's supposed to be something that you strive for and that is difficult, and that you go forth into the world in a way that will be misunderstood. And yet you witness to that faith, and by your shining example of being a countercultural Christian, that's how you bring people along. Christianity is at its best when it is not operating in conjunction with state power as a majority faith. It's at its best when it's the outsider, who Jesus was. And by the way, if people think that it's hard to be a Christian now, think about the original Christian and what happened to him. So there's a little something in post-liberal critique, and something I do say in the book, which is important at least to mention before we quit, is although I think the main reason that Christianity is collapsing in the United States is because of the tragic and misguided decisions that Christians have made. Again, we're talking about white evangelicals predominantly. I also think that we secular liberals have missed the boat. We neglected Christianity and faith. We forgot what the founders told us, which is that these sources of values need to be strong, that without Republican virtues, no constitution or democracy will survive. We could have made more room in our laws for religious dissenters. We don't need to require that every single small bakery in the country serve every single same-sex marriage. We just don't need that, we gay people. We should be more curious and welcoming of people of faith. We should include faith in our diversity programs. We should be more genuinely inclusive and involving of the people at work or in our offices or in our universities who are people of faith. We need to create a more welcoming environment. We need to start cherishing people of faith in liberal societies instead of just tolerating them and ignoring them, which too often we do.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you wished I'd asked you, or anything that you wish you'd had the chance to say that you feel I haven't really given you the chance to say?
I don't think so. You've been extremely comprehensive.
Great. Thanks so much for joining me, John.
I am happy to be here, and I'm happy to say the book is available in Australian English.
Really? Did they translate it? Did they add a few instances of the C word, which I'm not going to say here because we might get demonetized?
I hope people read it and enjoy it.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.